deployment that they apply to mutual aid requests to make sure that we can manage both things at the same time in terms of an overall demand.
Obviously, we're expecting the biggest protests tomorrow. What are your hopes for those protests? Obviously, people exercising their democratic right. What would you say to people who are going to go out and protest about this visit?
I think it's really important to remember that this is a planned event with a really experienced command structure associated with it, and I'm not part of that particular command structure. So as with every event, that we'd ask to make sure that people manage their public safety and that we support them in doing so with a really well coordinated and planned event to support their facilitation of exercising their rights, but also allowing people to go about with their daily lives in peace.
OK, Superintendent Sarah Johnson from the East Midlands Operational Support Service, we appreciate your time this afternoon. Thank you very much. And a little bit of a lull here at Regent's Park, I think it's safe to say, after the arrivals of President Trump and the First Lady a little earlier. Those two Marine One helicopters, one carrying the couple, one a decoy, arrived from Stansted a few hours here before they're off to Blenheim Palace for that dinner, some military ceremony. Not the full pomp and circumstance of a state visit, of course, but I think those images will certainly satisfy Donald Trump. The protesters, of course, will hope that it's the images of their objection to this visit that will be making their way back to the US as well. For the moment, from Regent's Park, back to you, Martine.
Anita, you take a breath and I'll do some work. How about that? Thank you very much.
Sounds good.
Wouldn't hurt me, would it? The government has published more detailed plans for how it proposes trading with the EU after Brexit. They involve what's being called a common rule book with the EU on goods and have already led to 2 cabinet resignations. But the new Brexit Secretary, Dominic Raab, has called the plan credible and innovative. Our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake, reports.
Only a few days into the job, the new Brexit Secretary has his first big moment, setting out the government's plan for life outside the EU, in black and white and in the most detail we've seen so far. Finally, plans put forward on trade, security, regulations and more.
Secretary Dominic Raab.
Mr. Speaker, the government is determined to build a new relationship that works both for the UK and the EU, one grounded in our shared history, but which also looks to a bright and ambitious future.
But MPs weren't happy that they didn't have copies of the government's plans. Chaotic scenes before the House was suspended while they were dished out from boxes.
The point of these statements, the point is to allow questions to be asked of the Secretary of State, and by proceeding in this way, this utter shambles, it denies proper scrutiny of this white paper.
This white paper sets out the right Brexit deal, delivering on the result of the referendum, taking back control over our money, laws and borders, supporting the economy by maintaining a strong trading relationship after we've left, ending free movement whilst avoiding a hard border between Northern Ireland and Ireland, or indeed between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, restoring sovereignty over Parliament and the authority of the UK Supreme Court, seizing the opportunity to forge new trade deals around the world, and maintaining cooperation with the EU in the many other areas that we prize.
Since ministers met to agree the plan at Chequers last week, 2 senior members of the Cabinet have resigned, and many more Conservative MPs remain unconvinced.
It seems to be the approach of the government is, we don't want to leave the European Union, how close can we remain to it, how little can we deviate from the European Union?
The Prime Minister has described this as a principled and practical set of proposals. It's been a long slog to get to this point, but even now Theresa May knows she can't please everyone in her own party when it comes to Brexit. So there will be fights to come over the details of this plan with Conservative MPs and with the European Union.
We will stop sending vast contributions to the EU every year. We will ensure that the European Court of Justice doesn't have jurisdiction in the UK any longer, and we will ensure that we bring an end to free movement. That's an absolute guarantee, not to be negotiated. Free movement will end.
Expect talk of breakdowns and breakthroughs in the months ahead. The government's white paper is the starting point for negotiations with the EU. Ministers will hope their plan won't be written off too soon. Jonathan Blake, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, let's talk about some of the detail with our correspondent Chris Morris. Shall we start with goods, and what's in the white paper about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long document split into 4 sections, and really only the first section is about the economic relationship, but that is where most of the focus has been. And as you say, goods is a really important part of that. And it really fleshes out some of what we heard from the Chequers statement on Friday, that there will be this acknowledgement that the UK will have this common rule book with the EU, which sounds terribly collaborative, where we all work on it together. What it really means in effect is that the UK would agree to sign up to EU rules when they're made, and if they don't, then they would have to accept that there are consequences from diverging from those. And the main consequence of that would be that frictionless trade would take on a bit more friction. So that's where the concern of Brexiteers comes in, saying you say it's a common rule book, but in reality it's us signing up to their rule book and taking on the rules which they will set without us having a say in making them.
We're meant to have some helpful graphics. We've been talking about goods, but it now says services, so there's a little prompt. Why not?
Let's move on to services. Now, the thing about services is that we know it's 80% of the UK economy. But the UK is proposing a much looser relationship with the EU than it wants on goods. And it's said essentially for the first time that passporting, which is the way that any service provider in the UK can sell its services anywhere else in the EU, that could be financial services from the city or hairdressers or architects or whatever, that's going to come to an end, passporting. So what's going to replace it? The UK had previously said we need this system of mutual recognition where I recognise your standards and regulations and you recognise mine. The EU's always said that's not going to happen, and this white paper sort of acknowledges, okay, that isn't going to happen. The UK's saying, okay, well, we need a new, bold, innovative system, partly, and I think this will carry some weight, because the EU can't afford to cut off the City of London. The City of London is as important for the whole EU economy as it is for the UK's economy.
The other important issue is movement of people, immigration.
Immigration, yeah. The thing about immigration is there's supposed to be a completely separate white paper, which has been delayed several times, on immigration policy alone. So there's not a huge amount of detail in this white paper about immigration, but there are some hints that the UK will be somewhat, I suppose, generous in the way it interprets the end of free movement. It says very specifically free movement will come to an end, but for example it's proposing what it calls a mobility framework, which is fairly common in free trade agreements, which it says could allow, for example, EU citizens to come here as tourists or for short business trips without any visa, for example. Again, the fear of Brexiteers is that this is just an opening bid, and this is something on which the EU will push and push and push, saying if you want free movement for services, we want something pretty close to free movement of people. And I think the debate will be, do we end up with something which is basically free movement but it's got another name, or do we end up with something substantially different?
It's a negotiation after all. I'm not sure what happened with the graphics there. Thank goodness,
I thought they did quite well.
Thank goodness you were here. I understand it more now from you. Thank you very much, Chris Morris. In a moment we'll have the business news, but first the headlines on BBC News. Touchdown for Trump as he arrives in central London for his first visit since becoming US president. The president earlier landed at Stansted Airport for a 2-day working visit where he will meet the Prime Minister Theresa May and the Queen. Well, ahead of his visit here this morning, President Trump insisted that his country's commitment to NATO remains very strong.
Afternoon, I'm Jamie Robertson. Business news now. The UK government says yes to 21st Century Fox's bid to buy Sky for £24.5 billion. However, the news comes just after Comcast raised its bid to £26 billion for the UK TV giant. The markets reacted to the bidding war, with Sky shares up 2% in today's trading. Disruption at Ryanair after its pilots decide to go on strike. So far, 30 flights between the UK and Ireland have been cancelled, pilots demanding more pay and better working conditions. And an own goal for Fiat Chrysler. Their Italian workers plan strike action after the car maker's main investor, the Agnelli family, which owns the Juventus football club, splashed out almost £100 million to buy Cristiano Ronaldo. The workers believe the money should have been spent on Fiat investment instead. So the government's new white paper outlines plans for how the UK, as we've been hearing, can continue frictionless cross-border trade with the EU in goods, set its own tariff for dealings with the rest of the world, and develop its own service sector, in particular financial services, independently of the EU. Financial services makes up around 8% of the economy. The reaction from some of the sector has not been that positive. Catherine McGuinness, policy chairman of the City of London Corporation, said today's Brexit white paper is a real blow for the UK's financial and related professional services sector. Ali Renison from the Institute of Directors feel reaction from the financial sector is actually going to be quite mixed.
I think the reaction from the financial services industry will be mixed. I think there were many who were hoping for an arrangement based on mutual recognition that it will allow the city to, in effect, replicate the effects of passporting, i.e. you don't need to be able to be present in an EU member state to continue offering services to them. And I think equivalence is the clear way to go from the UK government's perspective. Now that's potentially a more realistic proposition in terms of expanding the scope of the EU's current equivalence regime. I think it will be particularly an issue for foreign-based banks who to some extent are based in the UK to be able to have that access to passporting. But I think it's also worth noting that it's not necessarily something that a lot of the bigger companies have been waiting around for in terms of knowing what their arrangements are to make their contingency plans, because a lot of those big banks and financial institutions were submitting their contingency plans some time ago. So some of them have already taken steps to ensure their access to EU markets by setting up in other EU locations already.
Ali Renison now. ASOS shares have plunged about 10% today. The company said sales in the 4 months to June were 22% better than last year. Even so,